There is an old fear, older than monsters, older than ghosts, older than the dark itself. The fear that something wearing a familiar face isn't what it appears to be. Not because it changed, because it chose to. Across cultures, stories emerge of beings that transform, adapt, become something else. Not by accident, by intention. And the most unsettling part is they usually transform to survive. Because survival has always had a price. Hi, my name is Steph Fitzgerald, and I'm the Experience Architect. I design how systems shape human experience, and this is Experience Systems, where leadership, psychology, and design converge into living systems. But on Sundays, we step somewhere darker, a little stranger, a little softer, a little more midnight. Less lecture, more candlelight, more stories told too late at night. So welcome to Creatures of the Night. And tonight, we talk about transformation. Not magical transformation, not physical transformation. Identity transformation. The versions of ourselves we become when the environment demands it. Before we begin, it's important to acknowledge that Skinwalker stories originate within Navajo traditions. And those traditions are living, cultural, spiritual. Tonight isn't an exploration of those beliefs themselves, nor am I qualified to speak on behalf of them. Instead, we're exploring a universal theme that appears in many stories across many cultures. Transformation, adaptation, the cost of becoming something else. Transformation stories appear everywhere. Werewolves, shapeshifters, selkies, tricksters, skinwalkers. Different cultures, different meanings, different warnings. But they often circle the same question. What happens when identity becomes flexible? When survival requires adaptation? When who you are and what you must become are no longer the same thing? Because transformation stories are rarely about power. They're about cost. Every transformation asks, what are you giving up in exchange? Humans transform constantly, not physically, socially. Psychologists call some forms of this masking, adjusting behavior, adjusting communication, adjusting presentation to fit expectations, to avoid conflict, to increase acceptance. Most people do this to some degree. Different voice at work, different voice with family, different voice with friends, different versions for different environments. And often, that's completely healthy. Adaptation is part of being human. The question isn't, do you adapt? The question is, how much? And for how long? Systems shape identity, whether they intend to or not. Every environment rewards something: certainty, compliance, confidence, performance. And people adapt towards rewards, not because they're dishonest, because they're human. Imagine an environment where vulnerability is punished. People become guarded. An environment where disagreement is risky. People become agreeable. An environment where visibility matters more than contribution. People become performers. Not because those identities were authentic, but because those identities were rewarded. Last episode, we talked about the doppelganger, the version of you that exists in other people's minds, the reputation, the story, the double. The doppelganger asks, who do people think you are? The Skinwalker asks, who are you becoming to meet that expectation? One is perception, the other is adaptation. And together, they form a loop. The most powerful transformations rarely happen all at once. They happen gradually, quietly, incrementally. A small compromise, then another, until one day you look around and realize the version of yourself moving through the system would be unrecognizable to the person you once were. Not because you failed, because you adapted. An adaptation is seductive because it works. It helps you survive, belong, advance, which is why the trade is rarely obvious. You gain acceptance, opportunity, safety, and lose something much harder to measure: authenticity, spontaneity, signal. There is a concept that doesn't get discussed enough: identity debt. The gap between who you are and who you're performing. Like financial debt. Small amounts can be manageable, but over time, the interest accumulates. Exhaustion, burnout, disconnection, because maintaining an artificial version of yourself requires energy. Constant energy. And eventually, people begin asking questions. Why am I so tired? Why does success feel empty? Why doesn't this feel like me anymore? Often, the answer isn't workload. It's identity debt. Perhaps the tragedy of transformation stories isn't that people change. Everyone changes. The tragedy is forgetting which changes were chosen and which were required. Because survival strategies have a way of becoming identities. The armor becomes the skin. The mask becomes the face. The performance becomes the person. And eventually, people stop remembering what existed underneath. Maybe that's why transformation stories have survived for centuries. Because humans understand this fear instinctively. Not the fear of becoming something else. the fear of forgetting who you were before. So maybe the question isn't whether shapeshifters exist. Maybe the question is, what identities have your environments asked you to wear? Which ones served you? Which ones protected you? Which ones no longer fit? And if the system disappeared tomorrow, who would remain? Because adaptation is not the enemy, but every transformation carries a cost. And wisdom begins when we learn to tell the difference is between the mask we choose and the mask we forget we were wearing. Good night, my creatures. It's time to rise.